Let's turn our attention now to chapter 11 of Genesis, beginning with the first 9 verses, in which we encounter an episode describing the dispersion of various family groups. Some observations that we might offer on the literary context begin with a statement in verse 5 of chapter 11, where we see God described as coming down to see what humankind was up to. We consider this an anthropomorphism, for it attributes to someone who is not human traits parallel to that which a human being would engage in. In other words, we don't perceive that God, who is always everywhere, actually needs to descend, to come down, in order to view something. It's a writer's way of saying God, at this point, engaged this aspect of the universe a little more closely, and that gives the basis for particular actions that will then follow. It is interesting to be aware that the name Babel sounds like the word for confuse, and you see that those operate in verses 7 and 9. It's likely that we can track the name Babel through Assyrian etymology or word meaning to a term Bab Ilu, Bab meaning a gate, and Ilu is the Assyrian word for God. So the gate of God could have been the actual meaning of this title, Babel. What sort of things may stand out to us from a historical context or a historical lens in these first 9 verses of Genesis 11? One thing we might notice is the description of the building material. The writer specifies that they used brick, that is, a building block constructed out of dried mud, instead of stone. Now, the fact that a writer would point this out suggests that, from the writer's point of view, this was noteworthy. It was unusual. It was out of keeping with the world that he was accustomed to. If he's writing as someone from a Palestine frame of reference, indeed, to build with brick would be unusual, for in Palestine, the customary building material would have been stone. Something of a puzzle greets us when we notice that the multiplication of languages occurs in the context of chapter 11, and yet we're already aware of varied languages in the previous chapter. 2 possible explanations. One might be by appealing to the source theory. That would suggest that chapter 10 came from one memory stream, a group of people with that memory. Chapter 11 came from a different memory stream, and here they come together. Alternatively, if these are unified, coming from a single source or memory, then chapter 10 may actually encompass time that extends beyond chapter 11, so that when we reach chapter 11, we're backing up a little bit in terms of actual chronological sequence. You might be interested to know what regions are indicated by the geographical distribution laid out for us in chapter 11. Here you can see what the rough correspondence would be with Japheth-oriented groups and languages here in the upper left. Turkey, Greece, that territory. Those associated with the Shem families here across the mid to upper right. And then those associated with Ham, northeastern Africa, the Egypt territories, as well as the northeastern edge of the Red Sea. What may we learn theologically from these 9 verses? One observation that we may form would be this: that when there are arrogant coalitions set against God, intent on opposing Him, God is both able and, as shown in this account, He will follow through to thwart what their schemes involve. Also, we want to be aware of the sort of theological segue that these brief verses set up for us as we move towards the patriarchal material proper, beginning with Abraham, or more technically Abram, in chapter 12. He will be introduced in the end of chapter 11 as well. The sort of segue that I have in mind is this statement made by Gerhard von Rad, and it has been quoted in one place particularly in the volume that's known as Old Testament Survey. OTS there stands for Old Testament Survey by Lesor, Hubbard, and Bush. I have been benefited by von Rad's observation that's quoted here, and I commend it to you as we try to feel what is the impact in terms of plot development and the story that's being told. What should we be detecting here at the conclusion of the Tower of Babel account? Is it just an interesting bit of unfortunate trivia? Why are there so many languages? An etiological story? Or is there something more significant in the theological stream that we should be detecting? And by now you've probably read over the quote. Let me just read it for you. With the Tower of Babel account, the whole primeval history, that is Genesis 1 through 10, up to this point, it seems to break off in shrill dissonance. Has God rejected the nations in wrath forever? So we should come to the close of the Tower of Babel and have a real sense of a cliffhanger, with a sense of deep despair and dismay. Is everything lost? Until I encountered this observation by von Rad, I'm afraid I did not take so seriously the disaster tone of chapter 11. So I commend it to you, because on the heels of this then, the appearance of Abraham and God's covenant with him and raising up a nation and eventually a Messiah through the descendants of Abraham, this becomes a huge solution on the heels of grave dismay, shrill dissonance, as von Rad calls it, at the close of the Tower of Babel account. 2 further notes worth being aware of, and they have to do with this concept of making a name. We find that in chapter 11, verse 4, one of the major intents of that coalition of people building that tower was in order to make a name for themselves. Let's take a look at that. Here you see it in Genesis 11, verse 4. Let us make a name for ourselves. We may also comment that a tower with its top in the heavens is more than just a measure of architectural height. This is a statement of defiance. But notice this making a name for ourselves. We want to be something significant, and the way to achieve that is by exerting our own efforts to raise an edifice that will bring fame to us. Notice what God says to Abram in contrast. As we roll forward towards the beginning of chapter 12, a fundamental part of God's promise to Abram is that God will make his name great. I can't help but think that the writer of Genesis wanted us to notice those similarities just a few verses apart. In contrast to a human coalition, a humanistic coalition, we might even say, intent on bringing acclaim to themselves, God says, there is a way to that goal, but it will not be by doing it for yourselves. Let me do it for you as you choose to turn your future over to me, which is what he was asking of Abram. The British writer G.K. Chesterton has made this statement. God had written not so much a poem, but rather a play he had planned as perfect, but which had necessarily been left to human actors and stage managers who had since made a mess of it. What do you think of this as a commentary on the devolution, the deterioration from God's pristine and perfect creation, as we now reach this shrill dissonance toward the close of chapter 11, verse 9. The remainder of chapter 11 then gives us the background to Abram's family. We'll touch on this just briefly with this single slide. In terms of literary context, we notice that already we're introduced to the fact that his wife, here who goes by her earlier name, Sarai, is unable to bear children. This will become an enormously influential dynamic as God promises descendants, even a nation, to them. But from the outset, we're aware that this is an obstacle which somehow or other will have to be surmounted. As to historical context, we understand that Ur is the origin point for Abram. We know that historically to have been a significant city, significant enough that even now there has been recovered this enormous ziggurat on the site of ancient Ur. As to its actual location, generally it's located here on the far right of your screen, a little bit southeast of Babylon. Alternatively, it may be that there was an alternate Ur location here in the upper central part of your screen near Haran. We are told that Abram originated from Ur, made his way to Haran with his father Terah, and then after Terah passes away, Abram and his more immediate family will move on, making their way to the land that God shows them, which is Canaan. It's possible that the Ur involved in Abram's story was also located in the vicinity of Haran. Just one note of a theological sort that I would offer for your consideration, and this is just amusing. It is just a thought to consider. It's not at all explicit in the biblical account. Given the fact that Abram is not the only one to leave Ur, but actually Terah left Ur earlier, could it be that Terah also had been invited to the covenant? Could it be that Terah also had been invited to make his way all the way to Canaan, but stopped short? And then his son Abram receives the same call and moves forward all the way. Strictly conjecture, but it's interesting to note that Terah makes the same exit from Ur that Abram does. This concludes our study of Genesis 11, and frankly all of the 1 through 11 material. Next we'll press on to Genesis 12 with the opening of the patriarchal period.